I'm Chance Dorland, and in San Antonio, military means local. This is Military City, a podcast from expressnews.com. San Antonio Express News senior reporter Sig Christensen was embedded with the 3rd Infantry Division during the U.S.-led invasion of Iraq in 2003 and has reported on military-related topics for decades. On this podcast, each episode, Sig and I discuss the military stories important to San Antonio, both from today and the past. Lieutenant General Stephen Quast wants to emphasize education and new ways of teaching as head of the Air Education and Training Command. That is especially the case with pilots who spend a year learning the ins and outs of flying, which has been the case since World War II. And while the course syllabus has changed in some ways as prop planes gave way to supersonic jets, the basics have remained much the same. But big changes could be on the way in a test program called Pilot Training Next. So, Sig, great to have you back here on the program. We took a bit of a break while you worked on some very important stories for the San Antonio Express News. We're back now with today's topic. So, tell me about this new test program.
Well, thank you. It's good to be back. We were really busy on the border, in fact. What Quast is doing is a pretty bold idea. They're wanting to do a lot of simulation using intelligent computers that help pilots learn at their own pace. They fly less than they do in a regular flight program. They use simulators probably a little more. Although one thing you'll see across the Air Force and probably in the Navy too, is an increasing reliance on simulator time. And the simulators can be remarkably simple. They can be as simple as putting your iPhone into a pair of binocular-like devices that now give you a 3D view of the world. It's like being there. And then they use regular computers and put you in a flight cockpit type seat with a television screen or a computer screen in front of you. And that is a lot different from what pilots like Quast used to do, which was something they call chair flying. They'd put a mock-up of the cockpit instruments in front of themselves at home. They'd sit in the chair and they would go through their procedures using often using, if you can believe this, a broomstick as their joystick or the stick that you would use in the plane. So a lot is changing. The theory here is that you can train people better and faster and even at their own pace by putting a whole bunch more simulation time into the instruction process. Now, there are questions about this. It's not, for example, entirely welcomed within the pilot community. Instructor pilots are skeptical. They think that you're going to still need a lot of hands-on time in the air with the instructor. And they will tell you there is no substitute for the real thing, flying in the air, real flying. And so they're dubious. In this particular test, which was the first test of their program, 7 of 20 pilots didn't make it. They washed out. One of those pilots went into a traditional pilot training program, which takes a year. This program takes 6 months. And, maybe it'll work, but we need to follow those 13 pilots that went on to their next phase of pilot training. And we need to find out what they're doing. Are they learning? Are they as good as pilots who spend a year in flight training? Where are their skill sets strong and where are the skill sets weak? And as Quast will tell you, this is a test, and they're going to take what they learn from it and try to improve it. So it's all a very interesting idea, but at this point, it's not a part of the curriculum. It's not proven. It is still a work in progress.
And as you just mentioned, Quas, let's throw to a clip of your conversation with the Lieutenant General. We have 2 clips in today's episode. You asked him to begin with, of course, to explain this new program, Pilot Training Next. We're also going to talk about something that you just mentioned. We're going to talk about things they learned from the testing, all that and more coming up in today's episode. So now let's hear a part of that conversation with Lieutenant General Quast about Pilot Training Next.
We started with 20 students, and of that 20, 13 graduated and are out there in the pipelines flying. But it's still a beta test, because what we're doing is the data is the real pot of gold here. The data on performance and what is going on in the brain and in the physiology of people that are good at being a pilot, and how you learn that. So we've been tracking that learning. And so the insights we gain from that have to be balanced with our confidence in the data, because that's a small number of people. But we're also measuring masters at the craft in our current workforce, so that we are increasing the data of what a master at a certain job looks like, cognitively and physically. And we are using it as evidence on how we can train people to have those same cognitive skills, those same physical skills, to be a master at doing the job. So that's kind of where we're at. We did the first spiral. We have some data. We are analyzing that data. We are taking a look at it for the question you asked, and that is, what does this mean for the Air Force? You know, if we can teach people to fly cheaper, faster, better, and smarter than we did in the model before, what does that mean? And so this next spiral, starting in January, will be taking all of the lessons and the data we got from the first beta test and applying them to the second beta test. And that way, by next summer, we have some confidence in the data. That when I go to the Chief and Secretary and say, okay, Madam Secretary, here's what we've seen over the last year and a half of data. And we will apply it to the data we have from the other masters of this craft of flying, and we will be able to see what implications I can recommend that are factually based and scientifically reliable. And that might mean that we can produce more pilots with our current investment, which would be nice. And the question is, how many more? You know, can we solve this problem with our current investment in instructors and in iron, given these new techniques? But the one thing we will not compromise is excellence, meaning that the competence of these people, being the best aviators in the history of mankind, which is what the Air Force owns right now, will not be compromised. That we will not compromise quality. But we are on a journey of discovery to see if we can do it faster, better, smarter, and cheaper than any other civilization on planet Earth.
And so, Sig, as we've already mentioned, it's not just an idea on paper. This pilot training program, it's in a test phase. There's already students who have passed, as you just briefly mentioned a moment ago, students who have not passed. And so one of the questions that you asked the Lieutenant General was what they learned from the testing, where they had a better than 50% success rate, but I believe not quite as good as traditional methods.
No, the traditional methods see virtually all the students pass. I was just chatting with a pilot yesterday who's an instructor, and he said that when they get done with their training process, that virtually no one washes out anymore. And so that's really pretty damn good. That's really impressive. And these guys go on to fly specific airframes. So after 6 months of flight training, they'll go to a T1 to learn the cargo plane or the bomber track. And then they'll go, if they're going into fighter track, they'll fly the T-38, which is a supersonic jet. And then from there, after a year, they actually go to their specific airframe. So a pilot in a fighter track might go and fly an F-16, or he could fly an F-35. A guy in a cargo plane track could go and fly C-17s or tanker aircraft, for example. They spend a long time training you. Going back to World War II, 55 weeks was pretty much the norm. It takes a long time to make a pilot. And what we've seen over the course of time is that these pilots get better and better. So when Chuck Yeager is learning to fly in World War II at a place called Tonopah, they got pretty hardened to the fact that people got killed frequently. And by the time they got to their wartime theater assignment, they had already seen a number of their comrades die. And so there was kind of a tough skin that these pilots would have about it. You hardly ever see that happen anymore at all. And that's because the training has gotten better. The instructors may be better than they used to be. Maybe the pilots are smarter than they were. One thing you'll hear Quast talk about with pilot training next is that a lot of the pilots are ready for this because they're used to playing games. They're used to using simulators of various kinds. And of course, they're more computer literate than General Quast was, which when he flew, it was a long time ago. That's when he first started. So people are changing. Maybe this is smart. It's still a work in progress. So nobody can really say whether it'll work or not. But the time to test is now because it's more expensive than ever to get a guy into a cockpit. The planes are more expensive. And they have to make up for lost time. They're losing pilots at the rate of a couple of thousand a year in the Air Force, and they're having to replace them. Right now, they're not able to. They're actually losing ground. One thing they hope is that this program could help them make up the ground.
And then before we hear that clip of your conversation, Lieutenant General Stephen Quast, I'd love to hear more about the different tracks that you mentioned. Is that something that they place you in a bomber track or a fighter track or a cargo plane track based on your preferences? Is it based on your scores as a pilot student? How do they decide that?
Well, I can tell you that I think it pretty much is going to be based on how well you perform. Everybody has a preference. I think if you asked everybody in a training squadron what would they like to do, they'd all probably like to fly fighters. But who knows? Some people actually are fine with flying B-52 bombers or C-17 cargo planes. However, I think it's pretty much going to be based on how well you score, your aptitude. Basically, how you end up ranking with the other people in your class. Back in the day, which would be early in my tenure here, I went out to see a class where the last guy in the training squadron, the last guy that was the guy that, when I say last guy, he was the guy who was by ranking the last pilot in the group, and he got assigned to flying helicopters. And that was kind of a painful result for somebody who wants to fly fixed-wing aircraft, because the Army flies helicopters. They do not fly fixed-wing aircraft. But this pilot, I remember, beat on his chest like he was Tarzan and said, "I'll take that helicopter, sir." And he made it as good as he could make it. He was making what was kind of a disappointing outcome as good as he could. That's how it works. And these pilots, when they get into fighter track programs, and they need fighter pilots really bad, that's high speed stuff. You're a really good pilot if you end up being in an F-16.
And then finally, I hate to delay the playing of our next interview clip, Sig, but I'm just coming up with all these really interesting questions. I think this is an amazing topic, so I'm glad that we're talking about it. You've already mentioned, the difference in technology, how maybe the pilots are better, maybe they're smarter, maybe they're just better with technology and training simulations. There's even video games now that are very realistic compared to what was available in the past. And now something that we're seeing more than ever is the use of drones. And of course, those drones have pilots. So do drone pilots go through this same basic training, or is that a different procedure?
Drone pilots will actually get some pilot training. They will get enough pilot training to not quite be able to earn their own private pilot's license. But they go to a schoolhouse here in Lackland, and they do get time in a cockpit. They learn how to fly an airplane, what it takes, and they come down here to Randolph Air Force Base, and they go through a program that basically teaches them how to fly. And then there are other people at Lackland, and they include enlisted personnel who do weapon systems training and sensor operations. And I think that we will see a fairly good number of enlisted people in time flying drones, but you will not see them flying airplanes in the air. That is reserved for officers. It'll be, I predict, a very cold day in hell when the Air Force allows enlisted people to actually fly airplanes in real life. That's an officer track field. And there was a time when they allowed it back in World War II. Chuck Yeager got into the fighter track program by signing up for what was called the Flying Sergeants program. And Yeager, who was a aircraft mechanic, started flying planes. He did well in flight school. He became an officer. And the rest is history. And what people, I think, by the way, don't really understand about him is one reason why he was a great test pilot is because he understood a lot about mechanics. He could listen to the airplane. He could tell what it sounded like. He was very good at coming down and saying, there's something not quite right with the engine here, or there's something not right with the aileron there. And, that advantage of having been a mechanic before he was a pilot was actually an important part of why he became who he did, I think. But you're just not going to see enlisted people do that job. You will see them do drones, and drones have become a major part of our warfighting, as people all over the country know. They will probably fire a lot of the ordnance at the enemy these days. And one of the reasons why is because a typical drone can loiter for 24 to 36 hours. You have to change crews. You can fly that thing for days before you have to land it. And if you fly a fighter, his loiter time over a battlefield is probably, if it's a F-15 or an F-16, his loiter time is going to be about 15 minutes, maybe. I've seen an A-10 in battle, and they spent a lot of time over the battlefield. But jets suck gasoline or aviation fuel, and what you're going to see is a very short time on station for those aircraft. And so drones are a big deal. And right here in San Antonio, Randolph is the home for the making of those pilots.
And then without further ado, after that great explanation, Sig, let's hear our second clip from your conversation with Air Force Lieutenant General Stephen Quast, where you asked him about the things and the data they've learned from the testing of this pilot program.
This is a great question, and what I'll give you is something that you can really take to the bank without over-promising on the data, so that I'm not saying something that is not scientifically provable. But I will tell you that what we did is we broke three paradigms in Pilot Training Next. The first paradigm is pilot training has been a year long since 1953 when we first started doing it in the model we have today. Whether you're a good pilot, a bad pilot, whether you're the daughter of Chuck Yeager, and you've just got a natural gift, or whether you're somebody that really struggles, it'll take you a year no matter what, okay? So we flipped that and said, what if we made competence or mastery of the skill, the constant, not the time? Without losing the enculturation, meaning what's unique to be a military pilot versus a civilian pilot. So that was the first paradigm we broke, and we just playing with it to say, okay, once you've mastered something, you can move on. You don't have to wait for everybody else in the class in order to move on. The second thing we did is in the military, and it's almost a joke, in the military, like you're in the Army now, when you come in the military, I'm going to tell you what to learn, I'm going to tell you when to learn it, and I'm going to tell you how to learn it. And you can't learn anything until I tell you to learn it. This mantra in the military, because we in the industrial age, we were so big, there was really no other way. What we did at Pilot Training Next is we basically said, you can learn anything you want, any way you want, and any time you want.
And that brings us to the end of today's episode, Sig. I think we could go quite a lot longer. I love this topic. I love all the descriptions that you're giving out on today's episode. But we do have to say goodbye. Just want to give you final thoughts. Where do you think perhaps this is going to be going in the future?
Well, that's a very good question. The experimental nature of Pilot Training Next is kind of part of the problem. This is a test. It's not a solution. One reason it's being tried out is because the Air Force is trying to find ways to ameliorate the pilot retention crisis. As I said earlier, the Air Force is probably going to lose 2,000 pilots a year to the commercial aviation industry. That is the estimate of hiring for commercial airlines. A couple of my buddies from the Iraq invasion are now flying, have been flying for the Air Force. One is flying for Delta, and the other one is probably going to be flying for Southwest or another airline in the next couple of years. They're snapping up these pilots because they're very well trained, and they just desperately need them. That leaves the Air Force with a big problem. How do you make up all those pilots that you're losing? And this is a serious problem. Know this: air superiority is something the United States has enjoyed since the Korean War. When I was in Iraq, I never worried about being strafed. I never worried about Stukas bombing me. Ernie Pyle wrote about being bombed by Stukas one day, and that was the last time the United States really had a contested air environment. The ground troops have enjoyed air protection for decades now. And they've been able to call in airstrikes basically when they need them. But the problem that you've got here is that with all these pilots leaving, you've got to make new pilots. The business of doing that isn't easy, and it is not quick. So Pilot Training Next is a possible solution. But how quickly will this get put in place if it really works? It could be years.